Salt water at 28 degrees Fahrenheit has a lethal and immediate effect on the human body. The lungs lock up, the heart loses its rhythm, and in less than 15 minutes, the nervous system simply shuts down. Have you ever felt that chill down your spine that paralyzes your muscles? In the early hours of the 15th of April, 1912, the North Atlantic claimed more than 1,500 souls. Almost all of them succumbed to this unforgiving thermal shock. But against all odds, in the middle of absolute darkness, one single man floated in that deadly water for 2 hours, and he came out alive. He was not an officer trained for extreme cold. He was the head baker, and the decisions he made in the final moments of the collapse defy, to this day, every rule of biology and survival. The sinking of the largest and most luxurious passenger ship of its era is, in our collective memory, almost always reduced to unchecked panic. A severe lack of lifeboats, a dramatic failure in communication. We have heard exhaustively about the growing despair on the sloping decks, the dangerous denial that this metal giant could truly surrender to the sea. However, the account we are about to unravel moves away from the structural collapse of steel plates. This narrative does not focus on the silent gash made by the ice, way down below the waterline. It dives deep, instead, into the absolute limit of human biology. It is about discovering just how far the body and the mind can operate when the environment brutally decrees that life must come to an end. While the world around this man descended into absolute despair, with echoes of distress cutting through the dark night, crowds fighting desperately for a tiny sliver of hope on the upper decks, he embraced a completely opposite stance. The head baker adopted a methodical coldness that felt terrifying given the gravity of the situation. Far from yielding to the collective panic, he took actions in the bowels of the ship that bordered on self-destruction, at least in the eyes of medical science and survival logic. Any expert would tell you his choices would only accelerate a lethal thermal shock. But inexplicably, these unusual decisions wove a flawless psychological and physical barrier against the cold, the very cold that was paralyzing the rest of the crew and passengers. What happened in those hours of darkness was not a fairy tale act of heroism. It was a documented, true anomaly. We will now perform an autopsy on this physiological miracle. We will reconstruct step by step how this worker managed the logistics of chaos while the deck lost its stability. We will understand how the last man to abandon the immense four-funnel structure accompanied the vessel on its unforgiving descent into the ocean's dark abyss, and how, defying all mathematical, statistical, and biological probabilities, he simply refused to freeze. If you value the rescue of these true memories and the weight of our history, leave your support on this video so more survival accounts can reach new people. Now, we must travel back in time. We must descend into the deepest corridors of the ship, down to the exact minute when a subtle vibration, almost imperceptible to many, irreversibly altered the destiny of thousands of lives. We need to return to square one of that early April morning, a time when the illusion of safety still hovered over the black waters. The clock ticked silently toward midnight. The ocean around the vessel was terrifyingly calm, resembling an immense, infinite sheet of dark glass. The air temperature plummeted with every mile they advanced. The silence of the night was broken only by the continuous rhythmic sound of the propellers slicing through the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. Above it all, the ship's majestic silhouette stood tall, crowned by its four gigantic funnels. They expelled thick columns of smoke against a sky completely devoid of bright stars. High up on the main mast in the crow's nest reality was much harsher than the luxury of the heated cabins. The icy wind punished the faces of the lookouts. They strained their eyes against the absolute pitch black. The task at hand bordered on the impossible. They were completely unarmed to face the night, lacking binoculars in their observation post. They relied entirely on the human eye's ability to catch nuances of shadow. Trying to spot any anomaly in an environment with no light whatsoever, to reflect the danger waiting silently ahead. When the mountain of ice finally took shape just off the bow, dark and heavy, the fate of over 1,500 people was sealed in a tiny fraction of time. The command on the navigation bridge demanded a desperate, evasive maneuver. They pushed the rudder to its absolute limit, attempting to steer around the lethal mass. And it was exactly that decision to swerve that engineered the tragedy. The encounter with the ice was not a deafening head-on collision that would crush the first compartments all at once. It was a much more insidious, methodical, and silent wound. It was a deep, extensive lateral scrape that occurred several feet below the waterline. The ice tore open the cast steel plates right in the structure's blind spot, allowing the freezing sea to flood the holds without the slightest warning. On the upper decks, where the first class enjoyed their privileges, the collision seemed harmless. It was felt merely as a slight tremor, a dull jolt that resembled the sound of very thick fabric being torn. The gentle sway was only strong enough to interrupt whispered conversations, make the chandeliers sway softly, and tip over a few poorly balanced glasses on the mahogany tables. Many passengers smiled in relief. They returned to their nightly routines or sought the comfort of their thick beds, maintaining the dangerous illusion that this steel colossus was truly invincible. But in the bowels of the ship, the scene instantly took on terrifying contours. The head baker was in his quarters, resting after a long, exhausting shift, coordinating the ovens. He knew every sound of that giant. To a man accustomed to deciphering the ship's health through the noise of its gears and the vibration of the floorboards, that metallic shudder sounded like a definitive death sentence. He didn't need an officer knocking on his door. He didn't need a general alarm on the loudspeakers. He knew the lethal heavy ocean water was already overtaking the lower compartments. While the command crew still tried to mathematically calculate the extent of the damage, silent panic began to sprout in the lower corridors. The human brain, for many, began to shut down. Faced with imminent disaster, primal instinct usually locks the muscles, clouds judgment, and nullifies any chance of strategy. Crew members ran with their faces transfigured by tension. The floor beneath their feet began to gain a subtle tilt, pulling the entire weight of the bow toward the black abyss. It was exactly in this nascent moment of chaos that the head baker built his first great psychological barrier against the tragedy. Instead of succumbing to paralyzing terror, instead of running aimlessly or sprinting to the upper deck for a spot in the few existing lifeboats, he anchored his mind in what he did best: logistics and hard work. He saw a necessary order within the absolute disorder. He had the brutal clarity that if those people were cast adrift into the freezing water, the cold would devour their body heat in minutes. Rescue would take hours. Endurance would require biology, and biology would require continuous fuel. Without hesitating for a single second, he summoned the 13 men who made up his baking staff. The environment around them was losing stability. The agonizing sounds of metal groaning under water pressure became frequent and disturbing, but the baker's voice rang out firm and commanding, cutting through the dense kitchen air. The mission was not to flee. The mission was to ensure the survival of anyone who could float. He ordered his team, to immediately raid the pantries and empty the shelves. Quickly, over 40 rustic, heavy, dense loaves of bread were stacked up. He instructed each of his men to carry the absolute maximum load their arms could bear. The march that followed was a painful visual contrast to the confusion sweeping through the passenger areas. Families wandered disoriented through the halls, clutching useless belongings, questioning officers who tried to hide the true lethality of the situation. Meanwhile, the baker's crew crossed the ship in single file. They carried heavy batches of food up the luxurious staircases, physically fighting against the floor's incline, which grew steeper by the minute. Pushing through the heavy wooden doors and stepping out onto the open deck, the biting air at 28 degrees Fahrenheit hit the workers like a physical blow to the chest. The darkness was total, illuminated only by faint emergency lights. The first wooden lifeboats, white and heavy, were being uncovered by sailors, set to the muffled screams of women and the stifled cries of children. The chief personally coordinated the provisioning of those small rescue vessels. He passed the loaves hand to hand, organized the spatial distribution in the boats, and maintained extreme focus on the repetitive, mechanical work. This manual labor shielded his mind from the collective hysteria echoing through the air. This absolute refusal to accept the paralysis of fear was the foundational step of his improbable organic resistance. He had done his duty with excellence. Logic, the survival instinct, and even the unwritten right of one who helped the weak would have given him a fair chance to simply board one of those boats, to sit in silence and wait for the break of day in safety. He was right there, outside, mere footsteps from floating salvation. However, as the officers began lowering the first boats down the creaking ropes toward the lethal sea, he made a decision that contradicts every human instinct of self-preservation. He did not get in the lifeboat. He turned his back on the open air. He ignored the only existing escape routes, and he started walking in the exact opposite direction, heading back into the internal corridors. And before we follow this man's dark descent into the epicenter of the catastrophe, I will take a quick pause to ask you, what city, state, or country are you watching this story from today? Leave your comment right below. We make it a point to read and reply, because we want to know the faces of those who value the serious preservation of our history. Now, we must return to the vessel's hallways. We need to understand why the action he took in the following minutes, considered by doctors as a fatal mistake, was exactly what kept him from freezing. The upper deck, poorly lit and seized by a frenzy growing by the second, offered the last tangible chance to escape the dark waters. But the head baker walked the other way, crossing the heavy oak doors and beginning his solitary descent down the internal staircases. He left behind the icy, biting night air. He plunged into a suffocating atmosphere of urgency and mechanical collapse. The interior of the steel giant no longer resembled the luxurious, perfectly stable environment from just a few hours prior. The slope of the floor was now undeniable and severe. It forced anyone trying to walk to lean their entire body weight backward, gripping tightly onto the brass handrails that once served merely as beautiful aesthetic adornments. The electric lights, powered by generators fighting bravely in the flooded depths, began to flicker and dim. They cast long, ghostly shadows down the once immaculate grand corridors. The continuous, comforting hum of the massive propellers had been replaced by a macabre, terrifying symphony. The agonizing screech of heavy cast steel plates, the sharp crack of fine wood yielding to absurd pressure, and the distant yet unceasing echo of heavy water ruthlessly swallowing the lower levels of the ship. While the vast majority of passengers and crew fought desperately to climb to the open decks, driven by the uncontrollable primal instinct to seek open air and the surface. This man descended further and further toward the epicenter of the disaster. He struggled through the narrow corridors of the crew quarters until he reached his own cabin. The scene inside already heralded the inescapable end. The dark water of the North Atlantic was already invading the floor of his quarters, licking the soles of his leather shoes, bringing with it the dense, salty, metallic smell of the ocean floor. Being absolutely alone in a closed compartment, deep inside a colossal structure that is visibly sinking, is perhaps one of the greatest psychological horrors the human mind can conceive. The darkness was gaining ground by the second. The oppressive feeling of claustrophobia would be more than enough to drive any veteran sailor mad with paralysis. Yet, he wasn't there to grab thicker clothes, extra life jackets, or small items of sentimental value. His motivation completely defied the logic of self-preservation. He opened his personal locker. He grabbed a bottle of high-proof liquor, and he poured a considerable, continuous amount straight down his throat in the dark as the floor gave way beneath his feet. And it is exactly at this point, in the early hours of April 15th, that we encounter one of the greatest medical paradoxes in the entire history of human survival. A detail that completely changes how we understand the outcome of this night. Any physiology expert, whether in the hospitals of that era or in modern science, would classify this solitary act as an immediate death sentence, a miscalculation with no return. From a strict, rigorous biological standpoint, alcohol is an overwhelming enemy to anyone about to face freezing temperatures plunging to 28 degrees Fahrenheit. When a person consumes alcoholic beverages, the peripheral blood vessels, located just beneath the skin's surface, undergo a drastic and immediate dilation. The human body, in its vast natural intelligence designed against extreme cold, would normally try to quickly constrict those vessels. This keeps the warm blood protected and isolated in the central core, around the vital organs. The liquor does the exact opposite. It sends this precious, scarce reserve of heat straight to the body's surface. If that person is cast into the immensity of the freezing ocean, that warm surface blood will be swept away and cooled by the water in a matter of seconds. It accelerates the hypothermia process with devastating speed. From a scientific perspective, by consuming that heavy dose in the gloom of his flooded quarters, he was essentially throwing the doors of his own organism wide open, allowing the cold to devour his internal organs even faster. He was, in irrefutable medical theory, sealing his own doom. But medicine and biology operate in a chaotic, unpredictable realm when the body is subjected to absolute stress and unprecedented terror. What science considered a lethal poison against the cold ended up transforming, through a rare, providential anomaly, into an invisible armor. Thermal shock in glacial waters doesn't just eliminate life through the gradual loss of heat. It uses unchecked panic as its primary and fastest executioner. When a normal person hits freezing water, the impact triggers an involuntary reflex of extreme shock. The heart races erratically. The lungs go into severe hyperventilation. The scarce oxygen is consumed at a completely unsustainable rate. And the mind is dominated by a paralyzing terror that leads to immediate physical exhaustion. A large portion of the victims that night did not silently succumb to a long, drawn-out freeze. They were taken by sudden heart failures and the total, instantaneous collapse of the nervous system within the first cruel minutes of immersion. Destroyed by a biological fear their bodies simply could not withstand. And it was exactly this lethal response of the organism that the heavy dose of liquor managed to completely silence. The alcohol flooded the worker's bloodstream and acted directly as a powerful anesthetic on his central nervous system. His acute perception of imminent danger was brutally dialed down. The agonizing despair, which at that very moment was making grown men cry and completely lose their minds on the upper floors, simply could not find space or an echo in his mind. An almost surreal calm, a protective lethargy, took over his muscles and his thoughts. He wasn't blind or immune to the overwhelming gravity of what was happening around him, but the primal fear, that absolute terror that drains vital energy and speeds up internal collapse, had been temporarily unplugged from his operating system. With his mind relaxed and his body chemically anesthetized, he left his partially flooded cabin. The ship now groaned with terrifying violence. The bow was sunken deep into the dark sea. The incline made walking through the corridors almost impossible without using hands and arms to brace against the walls. Armed with an unshakable coldness that science could never predict, he began the grueling climb back up to the open decks. He didn't crawl up the stairs like a panicked victim fleeing to save his own skin. He walked methodically, like a man strangely at peace, marching toward the worst conditions nature could offer, perfectly prepared to face the abyss. When the head baker emerged from the internal stairwells and stepped back into the freezing air of the upper deck, the scene had morphed into a visual nightmare. The deck slope was no longer subtle. It was severe and dangerous. The ship's bow was deeply buried in the black ocean, and the gigantic structure of the stern was slowly rising toward the starless sky. The panic, once contained, was now a cacophony of distressed voices, desperate orders, and the terrifying sound of steel plates screeching under unsustainable pressure. However, thanks to the heavy dose of liquor consumed minutes earlier in the dark of his quarters, this man's nervous system operated on a completely different frequency. He walked with a strange physical and mental stability through the first-class promenade, passing by the heavy, luxurious hardwood deck chairs resting on the sloping floor. The physical scale of this colossus of steel and fine wood was monumental. And if you want to truly grasp the grandeur of the corridors he walked and the pieces he was about to tear apart with his bare hands, I invite you to check out our exclusive ebook, The Anatomy of the Giant. It is a stunning visual and technical dossier we prepared for you to explore every compartment, every engineering flaw, and all the historical artifacts recovered from the ocean floor. It is a true journey through time, and the access link is pinned right below in the first comment of this video. It is highly recommended reading for those who value our history. Now, returning to that tilted deck, what the worker did next defies all logic of the human preservation instinct. The last wooden lifeboats were being hurriedly prepared for launch. There was extreme confusion, which would have given him the perfect loophole to simply get on board, sit quietly, and secure his salvation. He ignored the officers. He ignored the escape routes. Instead of seeking his own rescue, he focused his attention on the heavy wooden deck chairs scattered across the slanted floor. With brute force, ignoring the biting cold, he violently began ripping these chairs from the deck. He dragged them to the ship's edge, hoisted the heavy pieces up, and hurled them into the churning sea one after the other, listening to the hollow sound of wood smacking against the cold waters. In the eyes of the weeping passengers, it looked like the act of a man who had lost his mind, a crew member destroying the vessel's property at the exact moment the world was ending. But there was absolutely no madness in his actions. There was, in fact, a clarity of thought and a tactical objective that the vast majority of officers had already lost. He looked at the dozens of people who had already fallen or jumped into the ocean at 28 degrees Fahrenheit. He knew, purely by instinct, that the weight of their wet clothing and the thermal shock would pull them to the bottom rapidly. By tossing the heavy deck chairs over the railing, he was, in a solitary and methodical way, creating floating debris. He was building tiny islands of salvation in the absolute dark. His tactical goal was to hand the victims in the water something solid to cling to, keeping their faces and chests above the deep freeze line. He kept up this mechanical, physical, exhausting work, throwing dozens of heavy wooden chairs into the icy abyss. He didn't stop until the deck's incline made it almost impossible to stay standing, and the 4 colossal funnels above his head started emitting disturbing roars. The structural collapse of the vessel was mere minutes away. The sea would soon swallow everything. But unlike the thousands running aimlessly, he was ready to ride the steel giant down to its very last breath. Before we follow this man's final steps in the structure, we need to take a step back and observe, from a wide angle, the terrifying vastness of that night. From afar, the silhouette of the immense 4-funnel behemoth no longer resembled the majestic luxury liner that left port days before. The bow was completely consumed by the Black Sea, dragging the brutal weight of thousands of tons into the deep. In stark contrast, the massive stern structure began to rise into the freezing air, pointing its gigantic bronze propellers toward a sky devoid of stars. The agonizing sound of cast metal groaning under brutal pressure pierced the silence of the North Atlantic. The final collapse of engineering was inevitable. The physical tension on the structure reached its mathematical, unsustainable breaking point. With a deafening roar that echoed for miles in the deep dark, the steel giant snapped in half. The front section, already heavy and flooded by unforgiving waters, violently tore away and began its long, lonely plunge to the ocean floor. The ship's rear section, however, violently bobbed back. It rocked on the unstable surface before rising once more, adopting a straight, nearly perpendicular stance against the waterline. It transformed into a massive, dark cliff of metal pointing straight toward the center of the earth. While collective hysteria seized everyone still clinging desperately to ropes, door frames, and internal handrails, the head baker maintained his terrifying composure. Thanks to the anesthetic effect of the liquor in his system, primal panic could not paralyze him. He walked, balancing with extreme difficulty, all the way to the very rear tip of the vessel. At that moment, it was the highest point, furthest from the water. Ignoring the absolute vertigo and the chaos around him, he climbed the outer railing of the stern. He mounted the edge of the steel frame, hugging the freezing handrail and turning his body outward. In that exact second, he was no longer trying to survive inside a ship. He was positioned on the outside of a vertical building that was slowly collapsing, patiently waiting for gravity to do its final job. The stern began its descent in a straight line, sinking into the dark like an immense steel elevator, going straight down into lethal 28-degree Fahrenheit water. He didn't jump into the dark. He didn't thrash against fate. He simply held tight to the exterior rail and allowed the structure itself to carry him down, keeping his breathing steady and controlled. His psychological mastery and his timing were so frighteningly precise that in the exact second the metal of the stern was finally swallowed by the black surface, he just let go and slipped smoothly into the ocean. No violent impact against the water. No being violently yanked under by the infamous suction whirlpools that dragged dozens of victims down. The last man to abandon the deck of the sunken giant entered the freezing immensity in such a controlled manner and with such perfectly balanced posture that his head stayed above water. Against all the laws of chaos reigning around him, he began his floating endurance run without even getting his hair wet the moment the ship disappeared. The moment the human body plunges into the icy waters of the North Atlantic, a ruthless biological clock is instantly triggered. The forensic math of human survival takes no prisoners. In water at 28 degrees Fahrenheit, vital heat is drained from the body 25 times faster than if exposed to the cold air on deck. For the overwhelming majority of the hundreds cast into the sea on that dark morning, this clock ticked away their final moments at a cruel, terrifyingly fast pace. The brutal thermal shock caused immediate, severe hyperventilation. Muscles locked up from the biting cold. Once healthy hearts, under extreme stress and dominated by uncontrollable panic, lost their steady rhythm and gave out in a matter of minutes. The agonizing screams that previously tore through the night silence slowly began to fade, one by one, as lethal hypothermia shut down nervous systems and collected its final toll. The chaotic, despairing noise that once ruled the waters gave way little by little to a heavy, sorrowful, and terrifying silence. But in the middle of this devastating, hopeless scene, the head baker bobbed in the absolute dark. The medical paradox of that April night was operating at full capacity. The liquor consumed in the solitude of his flooded quarters acted upon his body like a true, impenetrable chemical armor. That heavy dose didn't save his life by warming his body from the inside, as many might incorrectly assume. It saved him because it entirely anesthetized his primary perception of fear. While men and women around him fought desperately, thrashing their arms in the heavy water and burning through their final organic calories in violent spasms of terror, he remained in a deep state of protective lethargy. His heart rate did not spike. His breathing remained strangely stable, his pulse operating at a calm rhythm. Instead of swimming against the unforgiving ocean and burning the little vital energy he had left, he just paddled, slowly, rhythmically, softly, and continuously. He kept his head up and his face constantly away from the freezing surface. Think of the oppressive weight and agonizing immensity of that solitude, floating completely alone without any sort of thermal vest, swallowed by pitch black, surrounded by scattered debris, listening to the ghostly echoes of lives slowly fading out. That isn't just a test of human biology. It is an absolute test of mental sanity. The worker endured this liquid purgatory for over 2 hours. It is a time frame that simply defies and shatters any medical chart or modern extreme survival manual. He wasn't aggressively fighting to beat the sea. He understood that the only way to keep existing was to flow with the water. And if we pull our vision back for a moment and look at this scene from above, peering through the thin early morning clouds, all you could see was an unfathomable, completely black expanse. The vast, silent, borderless ocean surface had just swallowed every last trace of pride and engineering. This dark, freezing, untouchable panorama serves as a somber visual breath to help us understand the true, painful scale of the event. It reveals just how defenseless and tiny we are in the face of nature's methodical fury, and how unshakable the resilience of a single individual can be when their mind, under the worst cold imaginable, categorically refuses to accept the end of life. The hours dragged heavily across the dark ocean until the deep night finally gave way to the first rays of dawn. The gray light revealed a scene of absolute desolation and disturbing silence. It was at this moment that the head baker, still floating methodically and under control, spotted a tiny silhouette cutting through the waves in the distance. It was a collapsible lifeboat, floating precariously and lethally, its wooden hull turned completely upside down toward the sky. The fragile vessel was already covered by dozens of exhausted men agonizingly balancing themselves to keep from sliding back into the sea. He used what was left of his motor skills to approach the edge. However, when he tried to climb onto the hull, he hit a wall of refusal. The men, dominated by the primal fear that the extra weight would sink the small boat for good, blocked him from climbing up. The instinct for collective preservation closed the doors to the last refuge. Any human mind would have collapsed in the face of such rejection. He, with his consciousness still shielded by the lethargy of the alcohol and his unshakable coldness, didn't even argue. He didn't waste energy fighting his own crewmates. He simply stretched out his numb arms, grabbed firmly onto the wooden rim, and kept almost his entire body submerged in the 28-degree Fahrenheit water. He hung on the side, silently enduring the biting cold, until a colleague, amazed by that anomaly of endurance, pulled him up by the arms into the safety of the hull. When the massive rescue ship finally appeared on the horizon, the survivors began to be hoisted up one by one. The vast majority had to be rescued on stretchers or supported by their shoulders, their biology completely devastated by prolonged thermal shock. But the head baker gripped the rescue ropes firmly, climbed the long side ladder, and crossed the warm deck walking on his own 2 feet. Without absolutely any severe physical damage, this worker's survival stands as one of the greatest anomalies ever carved into the history of medicine and seafaring. He wore no special thermal clothing, he had no extreme cold weather training, and he did not secure a safe, dry seat in the few rescue boats. He absolutely defied all the rules dictated by biological science regarding brutal thermal shock in the unforgiving waters of the North Atlantic. While the greatest engineering marvel of its era, a steel giant forged to be invincible, snapped in half, and surrendered to the ocean's might, the fragility of a common human body withstood the abyss. His account is the undeniable documented proof that, at the epicenter of the greatest maritime tragedy of the 20th century, collective panic proved to be an agent just as lethal and efficient as the deep ice itself. Biology teaches us that primal terror accelerates breathing, drains scarce oxygen, and forces the heart into premature collapse. The freezing 28-degree water merely finishes the organic work that fear started, and it was exactly this fatal gear that he managed to break. The heavy dose of liquor consumed in the ship's dark bowels didn't warm him up, but it built a thick chemical wall against hysteria. With a numb mind, he made decisions that looked like fatal medical errors to those passing by, but which mapped out the only possible route for him to keep on living. He didn't stay alive because he tried to physically fight the ocean's vastness. Nobody beats the dark sea using brute force. He survived because he adapted methodically, silently, and somberly to the inevitable scenario. When darkness ruled and the choir of voices around him ceased, he floated in the void, sparing every single drop of his vital energy. The practical result of this unbreakable coldness was clearly witnessed the following morning. While dozens of rescued souls had to be hoisted on stretchers, their bodies utterly ravaged by trauma and freezing water, the head baker grabbed the lifeline ropes and crossed the rescue ship's deck walking. He walked on his own 2 feet, showing absolutely no severe physical after effects. The sinking on that early April morning will always be remembered as the milestone where mankind's arrogance met its final destiny. But the journey of this solitary man teaches us something far deeper about the organic instinct of preservation. He proves to us that mental clarity, at the exact second the world falls apart and loses control, is the greatest armor we possess. He was just a regular man, a coordinator of the lower decks who stared straight into the worst biological conditions nature could offer, and, against all odds, simply refused to yield. If this autopsy on the mind's endurance and the limits of the human body brought a new perspective to your day, subscribe to our channel. Leave your support on this video so we can continue rescuing these forgotten memories from the bottom of the sea, always with the seriousness and absolute respect our history demands. Thank you very much for joining us on this journey, and we will see you on our next deep dive into the past.